It happened one summer, a few years ago. I had set out with my knapsack, as one does, intending to climb Mount Hortaka from that hot spring inn at Kamikochi. As you know, there is only one way up Mount Hortaka, which involves following the Azusa River upstream. I'd climbed Mount Hortaka before, of course, not to mention Mount Yari, so as the morning fog descended upon the Azusa Valley, I decided to go up without a guide. But that valley in the morning mist, I couldn't get a clear view. The fog refused to lift. In fact, it kept getting heavier and heavier. After walking for about an hour, I considered turning back to the inn, but even if I just headed back to Kamikochi, I'd still need to wait for the fog to lift. Meanwhile, it was only growing thicker by the minute. Better to keep climbing, I thought, parting the leaves of the low bamboo grass as I went, so as not to stray too far from the river valley. For a long time, all I could see was the dense fog surround me, although once in a while, the lush green leaves of a beech tree, suspended from thick branches, or the needles of a fir would emerge from out of the mist, or sometimes the face of an ox or horse would suddenly loom close, but then they'd disappear in the fog again, just as suddenly as they'd appeared. Eventually my feet grew tired and I began to feel hungry. To make matters worse, my hiking clothes and blanket were soaked through from the moisture in the air, making them extraordinarily heavy. At last I gave up and began to make my way back down the river valley, following the sound of running water. I sat down on a rock near the river's edge, and for the time being turned my attention toward food. I got myself situated, opened a can of corned beef, gathered kindling to make a fire, and before I knew it, 10 minutes had passed. That fickle fog had ever so slightly begun to clear. As I took a bite of bread, I glanced at my watch. It was already 1:20, but what shocked me even more than the time was the reflection of a hideous face that appeared for just an instant in my round watch crystal. Startled, I whirled around to look behind me and saw a kappa perched on the rock behind me, just as it looked in the pictures. The fact is, I'd never seen one of these creatures in real life. It gazed down at me with a look of curiosity, clutching the trunk of a white birch tree with one hand and shading its eyes with the other. For a moment, I was so shocked I couldn't move. The kappa too seemed quite taken aback. Even the hand above its eyes did not budge. Eventually, I sprang to my feet, leaping toward the kappa, but in the same instant it took off running. Or at least, I think it did. For no sooner had I glimpsed it dodging swiftly away than it disappeared again. More and more flabbergasted, I began searching through the bamboo grass. And suddenly, there it was. 10 feet ahead, it had turned back to look at me, poised to flee again. That, in of itself, wasn't particularly strange. Rather, what struck me as odd was the kappa's colouring. At first, standing on the rock and peering down at me, it had been decidedly grey in colour. But now, it had gone completely green from head to toe. "Bastard!" I yelled, lunging again toward the kappa. It got away, of course. I must have spent the next half hour desperately chasing after it, rooting around in the bamboo grass and leaping over rocks. The kappa was light on its feet, quick as a monkey. I kept losing sight of it as I gave chase frantically, even slipping and falling a few times. But soon I arrived at the foot of a large horse chestnut tree where luckily a grazing ox blocked the kappa's way. The ox had thick horns and bloodshot eyes, and the kappa, upon seeing the animal, let out a terrified shriek and somersaulted into a patch of particularly tall grass. Now I've got him, I muttered to myself as I plunged in after it, close on its heels. But then a gaping hole I hadn't noticed before opened up beneath me. The instant my fingertips touched the cuppa's slippery back, I tumbled headfirst into deep, deep darkness. And as I was falling, I suddenly remember there had been a cuppa bridge near the old Kamikochi Inn. The human mind comes up with the most preposterous things in life or death situations, and then what happened after that, I can't remember, except for a brilliant light that flashed before my eyes, and before I knew it, I had lost consciousness. Hello and welcome to Snow Country Stories Japan. I am your host, Peter Carnell, and this is a podcast all about life and travel in Japan's legendary Yukiguni. This episode is another of my travel guides to destinations in the Snow Country as I accompany you today to Kamikochi in Nagano Prefecture. Located in Japan's highest mountain range, Kamikochi is a special protected zone within Chubu Sangaku National Park. Open to the public from mid-April to mid-November, I regard Kamikochi as one of Japan's finest outdoor destinations, one I have guided at many times and always relish taking my guests to. The reading you just listened to is the opening chapter of the 1927 novella Kappa by Akutagawa Urunosuke. It opens with the protagonist encountering a kappa while hiking in Kamikochi. In case you're not familiar, kappa are mythical creatures common in Japanese folklore. Water-dwelling, humanoid creatures with frog-like resemblance that inhabit rivers, lakes and ponds. Typically depicted as green, they have a duckbill, webbed hands and feet, and turtle-like shells on their back. Atop their head is a depression or plate which they keep filled with water. They enjoy cucumbers and sumo wrestling and are potentially dangerous, luring their victims into the water. In Akutagawa's 1927 novella, the protagonist follows the kappa into the subterranean world of the kappa. In truth, the story isn't really related to Kamikochi, other than that's where it opens and he encounters the kappa. But in setting the book there, Kamikochi entered the public imagination and it led to the first real surge of Japanese tourism. Declared a national park in 1934, Kamikochi is today increasingly popular with international visitors. The style of that book is often reviewed as blending reality with the surreal, and in that regard, Kamikochi is certainly an appropriate setting. It really is remarkably beautiful. One last thing, in this episode I only discuss the hiking trails in the valley and do not provide information about the more serious mountaineering trails that can be accessed from trailheads in Kamikochi. I'm not a certified mountain guide, nor do I have the necessary experience to provide accurate and safe advice about mountaineering in Japan without speaking to a guest. This episode is just me, no guest today. I hope you enjoy. Kamikochi is an alpine valley bookended by two mountains, Yakadake and Hotaka, and part of the wider Chubu Sangaku National Park, Japan's third largest national park. It is also part of the Hida Mountains, more commonly referred to as the North Alps. This is Japan's highest mountain range with multiple peaks over 3,000 meters. That's 9,842 feet and above. One of three major mountain ranges that split the middle of Japan's main island of Honshu, the Hida Mountains were wrenched upwards by tectonic plates working against each other, taking shape over the past 2 to 5 million years. Over time, the sedimentary and granite rock of the mountain range has been gorged out by glaciers up until the end of the most recent ice age around 10,000 years ago. Continued weathering and the occasional volcanic eruption has continued to twist, puncture and coax the landscape into what we see today. In winter, this is a place of heavy, heavy snow, considered inaccessible for most of human history. In summer, that snow disappears, but the precipitous nature of the landscape and dense forests which dominate the valleys and lower reaches of the mountains deem them wild places populated by bears, wolves, well, no more wolves there used to be in the past, powerful spirits and devious yokai. It is the domain of the frog-like kappa, the long-nosed tengu, dragons, horned demons, and in winter the beautiful but treacherous Yuki-onna, or Snow Woman. Only woodsmen, bandits, or the desperate or foolhardy would seek opportunity or refuge in the deep forest, and only ascetics and the legendary Yamabushi and other practitioners of Shugendo would venture to the upper reaches of Japan's highest mountain range willingly. So went that story, until the later 19th century, when the Edo period came to an end, the Meiji government established itself and opened Japan to the world. With that came the arrival of European alpinists, extensive surveying of Japan's mountains, and the introduction of mountaineering as a form of recreation. During this period, two mustachioed Victorian men of note stand out and are intimately linked with the history of Kamikochi. The first of those men was William Gowland, a British metallurgical engineer employed by the Meiji government, as were many Westerners, to progress the country's rapid push to modernity following centuries of self-isolation. In his 16 years in Japan, from 1872 to 1888, Gowland introduced techniques for the scientific analysis of metals and other modern technologies. But as a keen mountaineer, he is the first foreigner credited with climbing Japan's fifth tallest mountain, Yarigatake. Gowland was also employed to carry out surveys in the mountains and is credited with coining the name Japanese Alps. Around this time, the area that is today known as Kamikochi was opened up for cattle grazing, with the establishment of ranches there being the first semi-permanent settlements that high in the mountains. In the same year that Gowland left Japan, 1888, a 27-year-old missionary arrived by the name of Rev. Walton Weston. Weston spent a total of 15 years in Japan, in which time he developed a strong interest in its landscapes, cultures and customs, undertaking multiple treks into the North Alps, including his own summit of Yarigatake in 1892, followed by Japan's third highest mountain, Hotaka, in 1893, led by his local guide Kamijo Kamonji. Those treks were documented in his 1896 publication Mountaineering and Exploration in the Japanese Alps, the first account of mountaineering in Japan that achieved popularity in the West and would be instrumental to the founding of the Japanese Alpine Club in 1906, with the first official trails opened in Kamikochi in 1915. Now, that year is important. Remember that I mentioned the valley of Kamikochi is bookended by two mountains, Hotaka and Yakadake. The smaller of those mountains is Yakadake, a volcano, the name of which translates as Burning Mountain. It lived up to that title on June 6, 1915, when it erupted. The following account is that of an eyewitness in Kamikochi on that day. Earthquake shocks with increasing intensity were felt at 7 o'clock on the morning of June 6. A strong concussion was felt as the volcano was split open on the east side from the base to within 1,000 feet of the top. The explosions hurled out rocks, ashes, mud, steam and smoke with a tremendous reverberation of sounds, as the massive granite cliffs on the opposite side of the valley are only a mile away. Ashes fell at Kamikochi and the whole valley was enshrouded in a heavy cloud of smoke. The activity continued all day with frequent earthquake shocks, the roar of escaping steam, and the crash of falling trees and rocks. A row of new craters was opened along the new fissure, the principal crater being at an elevation of 7,000 feet. The ash and mud broke all the branches of the trees in the neighbourhood, and a large mass of mud and boulders slid down the steep slope into the valley below, damming the stream. The damming of the Asasagawa River by mud flow has formed a temporary lake, half a mile in length but of no great depth. In 1926, Kamikochi was designated a protected forest as an appreciation of its innate beauty entered the public consciousness, and tourism inevitably followed. That interest boomed only 1 year later in 1927 with publication of the novella Kappa, which opens with the encounter of a kappa, pursuit of it, and the tumbled entry into their world, much like Alice after the White Rabbit, while hiking in Kamikochi. To this day, the book draws visitors to Kamikochi. In 1928, Kamikochi was designated a National Scenic Beauty Spot and Natural Monument before being designated one of Japan's 8 original national parks as part of Chubu-Sengaku National Park in 1934. Cattle ranches were closed at this time, a bad day for the bovines, and roads were extended to the central area of the valley, known as Kappa-bashi or Kappa Bridge, which remains as far as any transport can take you today. Protections were extended through the following decades, yet with tourism continuing to grow and introduction of more transport infrastructure, there was growing concern of the impact of human action on what is an important and sensitive ecosystem. In response, private cars were banned in 1975, and to this day, the only way to enter Kamikochi is by using the public buses, taxi, or a chartered vehicle. Kamikochi opens to the public on April 17th and remains open until November 15th every year. Upon its opening in mid-April, hiking trails in the valley should be clear of any significant snow, allowing access to all the locations I will discuss. Due to the heavy snow of winter, Kamikochi is inaccessible to public transport between mid-November and mid-April and can only be accessed on foot on specialized snowshoeing tours. The 16-kilometer or 10-mile Alpine Valley has an average elevation of around 1,400 meters, that's 4,593 feet, and follows Asasagawa, Asasa River, a strikingly azure and clear river that flows down from the mountains. The river is as much a highlight as the many mountains that can be viewed or accessed from the valley, 2 of which bookend the valley itself, Yakadake, the Burning Mountain, and Hotaka, Japan's 3rd highest mountain. These and other mountains can be accessed via trailheads in the valley, but for most visitors, movement in Kamikochi is limited to the leisurely hiking trails that are suitable for anyone of reasonable fitness. Well-maintained trails, including some raised walkways to protect the ecosystem, follow the river or forest on either side, starting from Taisho-ike and leading to the central area of Kappa-bashi, and then onto Myojin-ike, and finally Tokuzawa. To walk from one end of the valley takes around 4 hours. Many visitors choose not to walk far and congregate around Kappa-bashi, the most central area, and only a short stroll from the bus terminal. It's in this area you can enjoy the famous view of Mount Hotaka rising behind the span bridge over the river. This is where you'll encounter the worst of the crowds, but you only need to walk 5 to 10 minutes away from the central area in either direction, and visitor numbers quickly drop off. Walk on to Myojin-ike and those numbers will significantly decrease. And should you choose to move on to Tokuzawa, then you really will be away from the crowds, with most people in that area heading to the trailheads providing access to the mountains above. The morning broke dull and cold. At 7:45 we started. Crossing the river at the ford, we quickly sped through the lower part of the forest which covers the level ground on the right bank. For a couple of miles, we held onto the route which I had previously taken towards Yarigatake. Then a sudden turn to the left introduced us to a small mountain torrent hidden behind the thick undergrowth at the east base of our beautiful peak. Judging by the way Komonji forced the pace, he evidently had no intention of spending that night on the inhospitable cliffs of Hodakayama. With his heavy knife, he hewed his way through the dense brushwood on the torrent bank with grim determination. On we went, now plunging through the icy cold water, jumping from one slippery moss-grown boulder, or scrambling over fallen tree trunks that lay on the banks. We then emerged from the denser part of the forest and a long scree, stretching down from the base of a fine cliff in front, at last gave better going. The perpendicular cliffs in front of us now forced us to the right, where we climbed to the top of a sharp ridge on the east side of which lay a small pool. Peering over the edge of the ridge, we found ourselves looking at a mighty kowa, or gully. Its western end stretches far up the main arete of Hodakayama, whilst on the east it ends abruptly in a precipice, over the edge of which a fine cascade, fed by the snow of high above, falls into a rocky basin with thunderous roar. To reach the floor of the gully, we had to descend from the crest of our ridge, traversely across a perpendicular rock wall. As we started the passage, Komonji turned anxiously and asked, Dare you come? It needs great care. Reassured by my answer, he proceeded, and the delightfully exciting scramble took us slowly but surely to the Kawa. We then turned our faces towards the north arete. A rapid climb up big loose rocks led us at 10:30 to the base of an overhanging cliff in the right wall of the Kawa. Another ascent up great granite slabs brought us in an hour to the first slopes of a snow at an altitude of 8,500 feet. The inclination of these by my clinometer was about 40 degrees, as steep as any I have met with on the peaks and passes of Japan. A few hundred feet over the snow brought us again to steep rocks, and from here to the summit proved the most enjoyable part of the whole expedition. The rocks were steeper and firmer than any we had yet encountered, and the call for our best energies made the work the more exhilarating. By 12:45, we were standing on the sharp arete, from which rise the great towers of granite that gave the peak its appropriate title, the Mountain of Standing Ears of Corn. Before 1:30, we were on the highest pinnacle. From the summit, which my RGS mercurial barometer made 10,150 feet, the distant prospect resembled that from Yarigatake, its northern neighbour. The abridged passage I just read was taken from Walter Weston's Mountaineering and Exploration in the Japanese Alps, published in 1896, accounting for his ascent of Mount Hotaka from the valley of Kamikochi below, led by his guide Komonji. Mount Hotaka, also referred to as Hotakayama or simply Hotaka, stands at the northern end of the valley. At 3,190 metres, or 10,466 feet, Hotaka is Japan's third tallest mountain. But it's only 3 metres shorter than the second tallest mountain, Mount Kita. Hotaka has multiple peaks, including Okuhotaka, 3,190 metres, Mai Hotaka, 3,090 metres, that's 10,137 feet, Kita Hotaka, 3,106 metres, that's 10,190 feet, considered to be the most difficult peak to summit, and Nishi Hotaka, 2,909 metres, 9,544 feet. It is a majestic mountain and one of multiple mountains rising above the valley. At the southern end of Kamikochi, Yakedake stands at 2,455 metres, that's 8,054 feet, and is the most immediate mountain you will encounter upon passing through the tunnels and entering the valley. This is the Burning Mountain, the active volcano that erupted in 1915, damming the river and creating Taisho Ike or Taisho Pond, across which the mountain looms. Scars upon the mountain bear dramatic testament to the eruption, while steam can often be viewed rising from near its summit. When entering Kamikochi, I recommend disembarking the bus or having your taxi or charter drop you at the bus stop outside of Taisho Ike Hotel and beginning your hike there. On a clear day, the views of Hotaka and Yakedake across the water are terrific and will immediately impress. From Taisho Ike, the trail begins as raised walkways and leads you into a lightly forested area before rejoining the river and affording the best views of Yakedake. As you continue to walk, you'll have views of two other mountains, Mount Kasumizawa at 2,646 metres, that's 8,681 feet, and Mount Roppaku-san at 2,470 metres, 8,103 feet, as you make your way towards the Tashiro marshland, from where you again have outstanding views of Hotaka. This is a good point at which to talk wildlife, as it's often here during the early stages of my hikes that I've encountered animals. Kamikochi and the surrounding mountains are home to plenty of animals, the most noteworthy of which is the Asian black bear. You will see signs throughout Kamikochi warning of bears and often listing the last known sighting in that area. This shouldn't put you off, as black bears are typically timid and want to avoid human contact, but they are there, meaning it's always best to hike with others and exercise more caution if on the trails in the early morning or at dusk and away from the busier areas of the valley. Japanese macaques, that's the famous snow monkeys, kamoshika, Japanese sero, deer, tanuki. Tanuki are types of kind of what they refer to as raccoon dogs, badgers, martens, and lots of wildlife are present and can be encountered on any given day. As you walk, the trail will split in two, giving you the option of following the river or walking through the forest. Both options lead you onto the central area of Kappabashi, that's Kappa Bridge. The walk from Taisho-ike to Kappabashi takes between 70 to 90 minutes depending on your pace, level of fitness, etc. Shortly before you arrive at Kappabashi, you'll see the Kappabashi bus terminal on your right, meaning you do not need to walk all the way back to Taisho-ike at the end of the day, but instead can board the bus, taxi, or your charter here. If you're using the bus, take the opportunity to pop over and book the service you'd like to use at the end of the day. Even if you have a return ticket out of Kamikochi already, you need to book the specific time once there, so do it while you're walking past. Around Kappabashi, you'll find the greatest concentrations of restaurants and cafes, shops and hotels. Given the ease of access from the bus terminal, Kamikochi is crowded, and to the best of my knowledge, restaurants and cafes don't accept bookings. On the busiest days, you'll have a long wait to sit down or even grab something from the food vendors. As a result, I recommend carrying your food with you on the day, allowing you to move past Kappabashi and away from the crowds and search out a quieter place to eat and rest along the river. Once you do start walking on from Kappabashi, I recommend following the trail on the left-hand side of the river towards Myojin-ike. Early in the walk, you'll have an unimpeded view of Hotaka before moving into the forest and bamboo grass, passing Dakezawa Marsh and other viewing points from where you can look into the astonishingly clear water. Ducks, including char and mallards, are common in this area. Fish are clearly visible in the water, and I have regularly also encountered monkeys moving through this area of the forest. It will take you around 70 minutes to reach Myojin-ike, or Myojin Pond, a series of large and small ponds formed by the spring water emanating from the mountains. The ponds sit beneath Myojin Dake, 2,931 metres, 9,616 feet, a sharp peak summit sometimes referred to as the standing ear of rice. If you can imagine a rice grain on end and a sharp peak. Again, the water in this area is strikingly clear, and with the towering peak of the mountain rising above, for me, this is the most beautiful area of Kamikochi I have seen so far. Access to the ponds is via Hodaka Jinja Okunomiya, a Shinto shrine dedicated to the deity, Hotaka Mi no Mikoto, guardian of the North Alps. Entry costs 500 yen per person. Outside the shrine, you'll pass Kamonji Goya, Kamonji Hut, a rustic outdoor restaurant and basic accommodation named after Western's Guide. They serve a simple menu of noodles and char-grilled fish, and it's my recommendation, should you want to sit for a meal in Kamikochi, to come here. Crowds should be much slower given the walk from Kappabashi, and I've never had any trouble being seated and getting a meal while there. Once you're ready to move on, crossing over Myojin Bridge to the other bank of Asaza River, you have the option of returning to Kappabashi, around an hour's walk or so, or pushing on to the most northern area of the valley, Tokuzawa. Allow 2 to 2.5 hours for the walk from Myojin-ike to Tokuzawa, or if you're going directly from Kappabashi along the right-hand side of the river to Tokuzawa, it's going to take you around 3 hours, meaning that should you start from Taisho-ike, my recommendation, the hike to Tokuzawa will take you around somewhere between 4 to 5 hours. This was one of the areas they used to graze cattle. It's now also a campground. We'll come back to that. And from here you have views of further peaks, including Chogatake at 2,677 metres, 8,782 feet, and it's here that you access the trailheads, opening up hikes to mountains including Hotaka, Yadagatake, Chogatake, and Jonen. Venturing past this point takes you into those mountains, undertakings that require planning, appropriate gear, experience, and mountain lodging. It's not something I have the expertise to advise on, so I won't cover it in this episode, but hope to follow this travel guide in future with an episode detailing those trails. Kamikochi has long been popular with Japanese, and in recent years its profile has risen with international visitors. On many days it will be busy and potentially over-touristed at times, with Golden Week in late April, early May, the extended summer holidays of August, and Koyo, that's autumn leaf season of September and October, being especially busy. I recommend that you avoid going on weekends and public holidays and getting there as early as possible, no matter what day you're going. I really like the period immediately after the opening on April 17th until the official opening on April 27th. While Kamikochi is open at that time, some restaurants and hotels are not yet operating, meaning visitor numbers are typically much lower. Trails should be open, while the mountains above are still encased in snow. Spring is also a beautiful time as new growth emerges, but with that, visitor numbers increase until another lull in the wet season in June and July. This is the quietest time in Kamikochi due to more days of rain, but I quite like it as the mists and clouds of that season suit that landscape and overlay the mountains with even more atmosphere and a brooding presence. From mid-July onward and through August, expect Kamikochi to be busy as the summer crowds arrive. This is the peak of hiking season, meaning accommodation will be booked up and expensive. Avoid weekends and public holidays through this period. The same advice applies when moving into September and October as the autumn colours appear earlier in Kamikochi due to its higher altitude. Golden larch and red maples put on a spectacular display, and it's definitely worth visiting at this time, but a lot of people want to do that, so meaning that the transports and accommodation will be likely at capacity, and again, hotels will be expensive. This is a good time of year to consider a private charter if it's within your price range. As the autumn leaves fall and winter creeps in, businesses close for the season, and visitor numbers also fall off quickly, making the final weeks at Kamikochi, that's late October to mid-November, another good time to visit, and the first snow again will be on the mountain. Whenever you choose to go, I recommend an early start to your day and getting into Kamikochi as early as possible. Try to get ahead of the crowds. This is an alpine environment, so make sure to carry everything you need, and regardless of what time of year you're going and the weather forecast on that day, carry things to keep yourself warm, dry, sunscreen, sunglasses. Always good to have some water, drinks and snack in your pack. Access to Kamikochi is strictly controlled. To do so, you will need to make use of public buses, a taxi or charter vehicle. While you can rent or use your own car to get yourself close to Kamikochi, let me come back to that, you cannot drive into the valley itself. There's no way around that. Tunnels leading into Kamikochi are attended, and anyone attempting to drive themselves in will be turned away. So how do you get there? Most visitors will start from either Matsumoto on the east side of the mountain range or Takayama on the west. The journey into Kamikochi from both starting points is easy. From Matsumoto Station, take the Matsumoto Dentetsu Kamikochi line to Shin Shimashima Station, a journey of around 40 minutes, and once there, transfer onto one of the large coaches operated by the Alpico Bus Company, waiting outside the station, for the 60-minute drive into Kamikochi. Tickets covering the entire journey, both the train and bus, an option of a return ticket, can be purchased in advance. There are attendants at the station who will assist you onto the buses, so it really is all too easy and typically takes under 2 hours. Also worth noting, there are a couple of direct bus services from Matsumoto into Kamikochi each day, departing at 5:30 a.m. and 10:15 a.m. For full details, visit the official Kamikochi website. Links are in the show notes and on the episode page. From Takayama, the Nohi Bus Company operates services from the bus terminal immediately next to Takayama Station into Kamikochi via Hiryu Onsen. The journey from Takayama to Hiryu Onsen takes around 90 minutes, and once there, you need to transfer onto an onward service into Kamikochi, another 30 minutes. The journey totals around 2 hours. Much like the route from Matsumoto, it's beautiful in its own right. Again, check the Kamikochi website for details, and worth noting that none of these transports are covered by the Japan Rail Pass. While you can't drive yourself into Kamikochi, you can drive yourself nearby and then use the transports for the final part of the journey. There are parking and bus terminals around 15 to 20 minutes from the tunnel leading into Kamikochi. That's the Sawando car park on the Matsumoto side and the Akanda car park on the Takayama side. Parking your car at either spot, you have the option of then boarding a public bus or arranging a taxi into Kamikochi. Personally, although the taxi is expensive, it's my preference for heading into Kamikochi as it potentially saves a lot of time lining up for the next bus service. I won't go into prices as they tend to increase each season. Best just to search online for the current prices around the time of your visit. Taxis operate off the meter with a set price you should be provided before departing. This is Japan, that price won't change. The final option for accessing Kamikochi is to arrange a chartered vehicle with a transport company. Whatever you choose to do, just remember Kamikochi is only accessible by bus, taxi and private charter from April 17th to November 15th. While most visitors head to Kamikochi as a day trip, many also choose to stay there overnight or nearby. In terms of accommodation in Kamikochi, there are multiple hotels along the river and mountain lodges along the mountain trails. The distinctively red-roofed Kamikochi Imperial is the most famous accommodation in the valley, while other hotels including Kamikochi Onsen, Kamikochi Alpan, Hotel Shirakabaso, and Gosengaku Hotel are all popular and the nearest options to the Kamikochi bus terminal. Remembering that you need to carry your luggage, there are also more distant lodges along the river, 1 to 2 to 2.5 hours from the bus terminal. Campsites at Kamikochi include Konoshidaira campsite, 10 minutes walk from the bus terminal, Tokozawa campsite, around an hour 40 walk, and the Yoku campsites, 2.5 hours. All accommodation options can be booked through the official Kamikochi website, while most are also listed on the usual booking sites including Expedia, Booking.com, etc. You should book well in advance and expect prices to be high given the demand. Staying in Kamikochi is certainly an appealing option, but not the only one. 20 minutes drive from Kamikochi on the Takayama side of the mountain is the hot spring area of Okuhira Onsen, comprised of 5 hot spring towns, the largest of which is Hiryu Onsen. Visitors heading to Kamikochi using the bus service from or to Takayama will transfer at Hiryu Onsen, from where it's a 30-minute shuttle into the valley. There are loads of accommodation options here, from high-end to mid-range and budget, with most having their own in-house hot springs. I really like this area and think that staying overnight in the mountains rather than heading back to the city like Matsumoto and Takayama, enhances the overall experience of visiting Kamikochi. Both Takayama on the west side of the mountain range and Matsumoto on the east side have lots of accommodation, and given the transports to Kamikochi run from these two cities, they are also popular places to stay overnight and destinations in their own right. Most accommodation in Matsumoto is mid-range business hotels, with some higher-end hot spring hotels in nearby Asama Onsen, while Takayama has a mix of accommodation, including traditional ryokan, that's traditional guest houses, and Western hotels, high-end, mid-range, and budget. Booking sites, again, such as Expedia, Booking.com, should show plenty of options. However you choose to visit, as a day trip or overnighting in the mountains, I encourage you to lock Kamikochi into your travel plans. It really is one of Japan's most rewarding outdoor destinations. I hope this travel guide is of assistance in planning your visit to Kamikochi, and once there, I hope you enjoy. I'm sure you will. That's it for today's episode. Check out the show notes and episode page for links to everything I've discussed. The official Kamikochi website is your best resource. That's kamikochi.or.jp. Kamikochi is spelled Kamikochi. Make sure to switch it to English. Unfortunately, their English language version doesn't stack up against their Japanese version. It desperately needs to be updated, but unless you speak or read Japanese, you're going to be stuck with it. But you will find information for everything you need there, including accommodation and transport. The podcast website is snowcountrystories.com, and you can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook. I'm definitely most active on Instagram, so if you haven't followed us already, please do so. My name is Peter Carnell. This has been Snow Country Stories Japan. I'll be back with the next episode in a couple of weeks' time. Until then, it's bye for now.